Okay, we're back. Whew, I'm taking this shirt off. Where did we leave off last time? Well, pretty easy because it just happened about 30 seconds ago for me. We left off at saying blowdown is completely and utterly useless. Why do we even talk about blowdown? Well, it could be a lack of understanding, but I think more than likely it is a metric that is easy to understand and follow and talk about for people. There is something happening there, right? But there's kind of nothing happening there. Let's talk about this. First, I should tell you what is blowdown. It is the time in duration that between the opening of the exhaust down to the opening of the transfers. Between those two, that is your blowdown number. Like I said, it's usually expressed in degrees of crankshaft rotation. So a very typical number for blowdown is going to be 20 degrees. As you say, I've got 20 degrees of blowdown. That means your crankshaft is rotating, your exhaust opens, and then 20 degrees later, your transfers open. So, a lot of folks say long blowdown is good. Some say medium blowdown is good. And others say short blowdown is good. Okay? Well, which is true? None of them. Blowdown is useless. It is an absolutely useless number in which nothing is happening except for exhaust is leaving. All right? That's it. That's the only thing that's happening is exhaust is leaving during that time frame. Now, if you have a restrictive exhaust, right, and you open your transfers too soon, can you get exhaust pressure down into your transfers? Yes, this is called reversion, okay? And a lot of people see that and they're going, I don't want reversion, so I need longer blowdown. Well, if your exhaust isn't getting out fast enough, then make a better flowing exhaust. Then you won't have the problems of reversion. Okay? Now, there is a point where you will get reversion. It's going to happen. All right? But it's not that big of a deal, and it's not that bad of a thing. But what I've been seeing, and I've been building saws now with, I think I kind of toyed around with 8 degrees of blowdown, sort of. But ultimately it kind of ended up being 12 degrees of blowdown. But that's beside the point. But like a good example is my Red 2165. Most of you guys have seen videos of it, and you know that it runs really well. Really, really well. Well, whenever I first built that thing, I had about 16 degrees of blowdown. 16 to 18. My ports were a little staggered, honestly. All right? And, well, it didn't run quite like I wanted it to. I was like, yeah. Well, all I did was go in and drill another hole in the exhaust, and bada bing, bada boom, it ran like magic. Okay, so reversion is usually fixed a lot easier than what people kind of stress about and everything. So if you feel like you don't have enough blowdown, just put another hole in the exhaust. Now, I will say that if you want a quiet exhaust, then you might need to run longer blowdown because you need to give more time for that exhaust to actually evacuate. But there are other ways around that too, and that's called your crankcase compression, your crankcase pressure. So, let's just go to my notes here. All right. When you change your transfer timing without considering what you have going on with your crankcase, disaster can happen. Long blowdown works really well for folks who remove a lot of material from the transfers, the intake, and sometimes even the crankcase itself, right? Because in stock form, you already are incapable of properly filling that crankcase, okay? These carbs are so ridiculously limited in what they can flow that our crankcase on a stock saw is not going to properly fill up the way that we want it to, okay? It's going to, in the previous video, I talked about how we operate off of a pressure drop, right? The piston goes up and creates a drop in pressure inside the crankcase. Whenever that happens, the outside ambient pressure flows through the carburetor and into your crankcase. Well, it just cannot do it fast enough. You've only got about 1/1000th of a second, or no, 1/100th of a second. Yeah, you've got about 1/100th of a second. Actually, you got exactly 1/100th of a second to fill that crankcase completely. And let me give you a little. This is going to blow your mind. The crankcase is, let's say, this big. Our carburetor is that big. Okay, so we have to fill an area this big through a hole that big within 1/100th of a second. You can't do this with volumetric efficiency. It cannot be done. The only way that you can hope to do it is turbocharging it. Somehow compressing the air to send it in faster, okay? So what you're always going to have in your intake, in your crankcase, is a low pressure area. Now, if you've got a low pressure area in that crankcase, and that's stock. And then you remove even more material from that crankcase. It gets bigger. The carburetor stayed the same size. You cannot flow enough to properly fill your crankcase. You can't do it. There's always going to be, not with a stock carb setup, heck, not even with a big old motorcycle carb, really. That's how the engine operates. So you're always going to have a crankcase that is a low pressure system as the piston is going up. Then, so you've made it bigger already. It was already too big for this carburetor to properly fill it, right? But then you take out material from your transfers, the bottom transfers and stuff, and the intake. You really like opening it up because it looks good, and you're good at porting and polishing and making it really nice and smooth and seamless, right? So you like doing that, and whenever you do that, you are removing material, which therefore creates an even larger crankcase. Whenever you create an even larger crankcase, you have even more of a pressure drop inside that crankcase, right? Because your carburetor didn't start flowing more, but you made your crankcase bigger. Well, you still are going to have the problems of a low pressure system in your crankcase. The only way that we can get this to get pushed up through the transfers is to create higher pressure. So as the piston comes down, we pressurize it until finally it gets released and goes up top. All right? Now, if you know what you're doing, excuse me, right? If you learn a way of porting and you find out what works well for you, then you can get good power doing it in the way that I just described. You can, all right? Charlie, this is for you, buddy, all right? Charlie has done some really, and I'm talking about Charles Briscoe, okay? He's done some really great work, and he's really fantastic. But whenever there's no real but there. He's great, okay? But what's going on is he talked about, I think he said he did it on a 372 XP, a Husqvarna 372. And he ported the saw, and it ran good, and he liked it, right? I think he said he had about 24 degrees of blowdown with it. That's the way he typically kind of does things, kind of, right? And then he thought, I want to try short blowdown. And so he went from, say, 24 degrees of blowdown to 18 degrees of blowdown. I think that's what he did. And he felt like the saw lost torque. All right. He felt like he lost power, and it just didn't have the throttle response he liked, and it was a dog in the wood. Okay. Well, let me explain that, because Charlie ain't lying. I believe Charlie completely that this happened to him. Well, why did it happen? There could be multiple reasons, like possibly the exhaust wasn't flowing well enough. I don't think that's the reason, though, because Charlie does really nice muffler mods. I think the reason is because he had it set up working well with a larger crankcase area, and then he went and he changed his blowdown. He raised his transfers by a full 4 or 6 degrees, which, what does that mean? That means that's 4 or 6 degrees less time for the piston to build pressure in his crankcase. So then, as he's building pressure, it gets released too soon, and it's under a low pressure. And so therefore, he gets some reversion. All right? So if you are building your way, all right, and it is working for you, then that's great, right? What I am suggesting is that whenever you're removing a lot of material from your crankcase, from your lower transfers, from your intake, all you're doing is, for no other reason, creating issues with a low pressure crankcase. All right. We already, in our stock trim, cannot properly fill the crankcase with our little teeny tiny carbs that come on stock. Okay. The 361 clone that I'm currently working on, in stock trim, the carburetor was small. And so if I was to do anything crazy with the transfers and go with low blowdown on them, then I may not have enough crankcase pressure because I'm already undercarbureted. However, if I give it a bigger carburetor, and it's not so big that the intake can't support it, but I give it a bigger carburetor like I did, then it's providing more flow to the crankcase, which means I can raise my upper transfers higher, run less blowdown, and have a more powerful saw. But everything works in a balance, completely and totally in a balance. And if you take away from here, which I'm sure by now Charlie has figured out that's what happened whenever he had the situation that I was just describing. What he had was a saw that was set up to run well the way that he normally runs them, all right, and builds them. And then he just, as an afterthought, raised the transfers. Well, whenever he did that, it's not that short blowdown gives you less power. It's that in that situation, he was already set up for long blowdown. All right? So it's all a balance. All of it's a balance. So anyways, let's see what we got going on here. The 5 Series specifically. Okay, so if the transfer is open at 120 degrees and then bottom dead center is 180, then we've only got 60 degrees of useful time in which the transfers are open that we're pushing fuel up to the top. Well, what we have to do is we have to give it more time. Start looking at your transfers as time instead of duration, or and I guess I learned that probably from Jeff Seacombe. I think he's the one that told me about the time. Start seeing your transfer opening as time instead of duration, because the higher the RPMs go, the less time that we have. If you put it this way, like if our piston is moving 200 times per second, right? It's actually full rotations. So it goes up 200 times and it comes down 200 times per second at 12,000 RPMs. Well, if we cut that in half, right, then we're only running 6,000 RPMs. And at 6,000 RPMs, then we're doing 100 times per second. So it goes up and down 100 times per second. We just literally cut it in half. So we doubled the dwell time of our ports, right? So at 6,000 RPMs, our saw is much more capable of completely flowing all of the fuel and air mixture from our crankcase up to our upper transfers and into our combustion chamber. So that's why the old saws ran so well and had so much torque at low RPM, right? I can remember running Chad's Pioneer, I think it was a P41, or might have been a P42, something like that, and it had low, sluggish RPMs, right? But damn it, if that thing didn't produce a hell of a lot of torque and power at those low RPMs. It really did. So, you know, I could run a 32-inch bar on a 65cc saw and dig it through the wood. Well, that's because it was capable of moving its fuel. It was capable of moving it. What we are finding with our high revving saws of today, we are not capable of moving all the fuel. And so we need to give it significantly more time to move that fuel. There are other ways you can do it too. You can have more pressure in your crankcase so that it shoots up faster and everything. But ultimately, you need to find some way to give more time for the transfer of the fuel in your crankcase to up above the piston, right? The way that we do that typically is we raise those transfers. And so, whenever I machined and lowered the cylinders on the Husqvarna 545, the 2258, the Red Max 5000, I left the transfers alone because my way of thinking was that I couldn't shape them better than factory did, and I wanted to keep them small so that I would keep velocity up and everything. But what they ended up doing is just making my transfers even worse because I had less time. They were lower, so I had even less time for them to be open. And so I'm literally not capable of pulling into the 12 and 13,000 range with it because I literally don't have enough time. Whenever the piston starts moving so fast, up and down, whenever it starts moving so fast, the time for all the transfer to take place is literally cut in half. And so you have to open up your transfers. It's absolutely critical. And as I think we already discussed in the previous video, with these 5 series saws, you probably have about 8 degrees of your transfer opening that is spent on doing nothing but moving out fresh air. Because remember, this whole front portion of your transfer is packed with fresh air. There is no fuel and air mixture there. So you've got to push all that out and out the exhaust so that you have nothing but good, fresh fuel and air mixture up top. So transfers are the absolute key to these 5 series saws. Especially if you machine them and set them down lower, you're lowering the transfers even further. So, yeah, absolutely critical. Now, specifically, my Red Max not running. Let me get that piston. My Red Max not running the way that it should have ran is because I cut the skirt off. Now, with these 5 series, that cutout right there on the piston is literally holding air. And it goes all the way down to about right like that. So you can see that if I remove the skirt completely, then it exposes the bottom portion of this air jacket. Really, it's all it is. It is meant to hold air. That's all this is meant to do. And so every time my piston came to bottom dead center, whenever I had the cylinder in which I removed the skirt, every time I came to bottom dead center, all of the air that was in here was being expelled into the crankcase, which made me run in a lean condition. Right? Now, I was already in a lean condition with that, and then you multiply that by it being cold out, me not having properly warmed up the saw, and, of course, the skirt issue. The saw just was completely lean and would barely run at all. So that's why it didn't work at SawFest. That was a junk cylinder that I had already messed up anyways, and I didn't mind playing around with it. And so we got to go back into that saw and do, I don't know, round 4 or something like that. But yeah, I hope you got something out of this video. I don't know if I said everything that I wanted to say or not, but that's the dealio, and blowdown don't mean shit. It's just it's just simply nothing is happening there at all except for the gas is leaving. You're not taking in more fuel. You're not adding more fuel. You're not doing tighter compression. All it is your exhaust is leaving. And if you feel like you have too little blowdown, make your exhaust opening higher or more open. Make it flow better. You could also raise the floor of your intake. That way you have more time for your piston to build pressure and shoot through the higher pressure exhaust. Anyways, yeah. Hopefully that made some sense to somebody.